Hey everybody, welcome back to APM Help Academy. Today we're going to be talking about receiving rent payments. Certainly a very important part of the software and the property management business in general. So one of the things I want to start with here is I am on the banking page in Buildium. You're going to be working a lot in here in the software. So we just go to accounting, then banking, has the list of all of our bank accounts that we're tracking in the software. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is setting up online rent collection. Now, in these bank accounts, we can see ePay is not enabled on any of these. So if you do sign up for ePay with Buildium and they approve your application, you would see a green check mark right here in this box. And that tells you that ePay is turned on for that bank account and you can use ePay for it, okay? So one of the important things here too, by the way, is that once you do get ePay enabled, it is super important that you go into the bank account, click on payment settings, and here you would have a list of settings that you can implement. So in other words, setting up the convenience fees you'll be charging the tenants and which properties you want to turn ePay on for. All right. And that can be done, over here as well. That is, of course, if every property, their operating account is this bank account. Otherwise, you have to change that. But you can turn ePay on or off from here. You could also turn it on or off from here. But this section is really important just to get the settings set up, because if you're getting charged EFT fees by Buildium and you don't charge it back to the tenants using these settings, well, then you're out that money, unfortunately. So really important you get that set up, okay? So that's the first thing. The next thing I'm going to do is take a look at the tenant portal. I'm going to show you what that looks like and what you can look out for in there. So I'm going to navigate to a tenant's profile. And one thing that's cool is I can sign in as any of my tenants just by clicking this. And this is in their profile, by the way. It's just in a tenant profile, all right? And that will bring me right into their resident portal. Now, when you have ePay enabled and the tenant can pay online, the page looks exactly as it does now. The only difference is that in this box right here, there's the option to make payment or set up auto pay. So that's like really the only difference, and it's clear as day that they can see it there. They can also do it from their payment section right here. There's an area where you can set up auto pay or make payment. And what's cool too is it also tells you if you have auto pay set up and when that scheduled payment is going to pull. It would tell you right in here as well. So that's pretty cool. So again, if you ever need to help your tenants, you can always sign in as them and see exactly what they see when logging in here. All right. Now, one thing I want to point out too that's pretty important, when you sign in as a tenant, the only difference that you're going to see potentially is if you have a tenant that's on multiple lease ledgers, right? And you need to navigate between the leases. For the tenant, they would click on their name in the top right, and then there would be an option to switch accounts. You will not see that option because Buildium would want you to sign in as their other profile, essentially, or for that unit. So for the tenant, they're going to see the option to switch accounts. You would not see that. Just want to point that out there. But again, that only applies if the tenant's on more than one lease. So maybe they have a storage unit with you or something like that. And that's why they need to navigate between the two lease ledgers. Okay. One thing I wanted to point out too, this is the portal in terms of just going through a URL. I highly recommend the Buildium Resident Center app. It is a really great app. And the tenants can find it in their Apple Store or Google Store. It's really easy to navigate. They can also switch between units in the app. So if someone's a heavy phone user, I would recommend they just download the app instead of having to log in through a URL. All right. So that's a little bit about the tenant portal. All right. So now if a tenant is paying you though by check or money order, cashier's check, you name it, something that's not EFT or Buildium's ePay system, what you want to do is record their payment manually. And I can show you guys how to do that. So I'm going to navigate back to a tenant's lease ledger. How you could get here is multiple different ways. Like a really quick way is I can look up a tenant's name and then click on lease ledger right here, and it will bring me directly to their ledger. So that's one of the really quick ways I like to get to a ledger. It's just fast and easy. You could also get there from multiple different ways. You can go to rentals and rent roll, click on the tenant's lease, go to financials, and it'll take you right here too. So if I want to record that I received a payment from a tenant, it's as simple as this. And I just want you to keep in mind, you want to replicate what happened in the real world. That's the whole point of using Buildium in a lot of ways. You want to mirror what's happening in the real world. So I can click on receive payment. Now keep in mind the date here, this isn't based off of the date the money got deposited into the bank account. This date is kind of reflecting when did the tenant hand you this check or money order, whatever. That's ideally what you want to use for the date here. And just keep in mind whatever date you choose here as well is what's going to populate on the owner's statement. So if I record this for August 2nd, August 3rd, whatever, this is going to show on the owner's statement on that day specifically. Now, when it comes to a security deposit, though, it wouldn't show on their statement if you have a certain setting turned off where you don't display liabilities at all. And that setting can be found under settings, application settings. Go down here to rent owner statements, and I can turn off the ability for owners to see liabilities broken down in their rent owner statement. I personally like to have this turned off. I like to keep it simple for owners, just a simple income and expense breakdown for them. But anyways, going back to this, if I received a security deposit payment from a tenant on August 3rd, I'll record it as August 3rd. Okay. Then it asks you for a payment method. And maybe the tenant gave you a cashier's check, right? Which, by the way, I do prefer certified funds when it comes to deposits. Fill out the check number if applicable. Any memo you want to put, you could put like, deposit payment, something like that. You can email a receipt to the tenant. You could also print a receipt if you want to. I just go ahead and click save payment. And there you have it. The payment's now in the ledger. All right, and the tenant would be able to see this in their portal as well. Remember, anything you put in the memo right here, the tenant's going to see that. The tenants don't see the GL account. Like, they don't see this as security deposit liability. They see the memo, security deposit, deposit payment. Those are the things that they would see in their portal. So keep that in mind. All right. Now, one thing that's really important, when you record a payment on a tenant's ledger, it does not go into the bank account in the Buildium world, if you will. So if I go to accounting, then banking, and I go here and I click record deposit, my tenant's payment's right there under what's called an undeposited payments queue. Because Buildium doesn't just assume just because you got a cashier's check maybe on August 3rd, maybe you didn't go to the bank right on that day to deposit the money. Maybe you didn't go until a week later or a few days later. So what I would have to do is replicate the real world. So if I deposited this $800 payment a few days later or something, I would select the payment. Let's say I deposited it into the bank. It shows them a statement on August 8th. And I can put something in the memo here, Jackson Blake SD payment, something like that. Click save. And that puts the money right in the account like this. All right. Now we'll go over this a little more in future video to come, but I just wanted to break this down because it's really important because it relates to the tenant ledgers and the manual payment process. All right. So yeah, that's just a little bit about that. Now, moving on to auto charges and late fees. So auto charges, of course, are super important on ledgers. I touched on it a little bit when we talked about creating leases and whatnot, but for whatever reason, if you need to make changes, you made a mistake, we're going to look at a couple tabs that are important. The first one is the rent tab. Now, I like to think of this as anything you want to show on certain reports as rent. Okay, so if I edit this, and maybe for an owner like a report of some sort, like the rent paid report, the rent roll report, maybe you don't want the rent to show as $800 because there's a monthly pet fee of $50 too. And you want that to be part of the total rent that shows in a certain report. All right. I could do something like this, click save. Now, when an owner runs a certain report, depending on which one they're running, something that is applicable to looking at, recurring charges for rent or something on accrual, you name it, this is going to show as total rent for $850 instead. But maybe you don't want it to be like that. Maybe you want, the rent to just show us $800 on a certain report. And then there's an additional charge on top of that is for parking. And you don't want the parking to be considered rent really on the rent paid report, or you just want it to show as a separate kind of thing on that report. Then you could go ahead and add a recurring charge just like this and put it in for parking income, pet fee, you name it. Okay. Put the amount. The next date I want the system to start charging it automatically. That's what this means, by the way. It just means like, when do you want the system to start charging it automatically? Maybe if you missed some charges in the past, what's pretty cool, maybe I want it to go all the way back and pick up on all the missed charges I missed starting in January 1st. It will put them all in. So that's something that's pretty cool. But just be careful with that, of course. Otherwise, you got to delete a bunch of charges you didn't mean to put in. So, all right. But I want it to start charging on September 1st. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit about automated charges. It is pretty straightforward. For the rent, though, another thing I wanted to touch on is, now this applies really a lot to commercial leases, especially, is adding future rent charges. So these are really important to do right. Okay, now you typically don't have to do this, I feel like, when it comes to renewals in Buildium, because when you process a renewal, it's going to ask you what the new rent is or if it's staying the same. So typically you wouldn't have to do this too much for a lease that's just renewing. That's why I mentioned the commercial property part of it, because commercial properties have a lot of future rent increases already implemented in the lease agreement. All right, guys, so I'm going to show you how to put in a future rent increase. And again, I do this a lot for the clients who have, commercial properties especially. So if I want to put in a rent increase for, let's say, September 1st, 2026, then you would want it to actually start on September 1st, 2026. When's the next due date? Now, typically it's probably just going to be the same date. The only time maybe that this would vary is, for some kind of circumstance where maybe you don't want the automated rent to start until a month later, 2 months later. That's pretty rare, though, to be honest. For the most part, this is typically going to match this. I feel like the only time I see it be different is if, like, someone forgot to put in a rent increase, right? And maybe they want to, like, put the history that it started on September 1st. We already put in the charges for September and October, so I don't want it to start until November. Something like that. But anyways, so maybe I want to put, I don't want to have to, remember to put in a rent increase. So I put it in here that Buildium's going to start charging the new rent of $900 starting September 1st. Put in a memo, rent, save. And just like that, Buildium will automatically start charging an increase of rent on this day. So that's pretty cool. One thing I wanted to point out too is going back to that split rent feature right here. I feel like it's super important whenever you have affordable housing tenants. To me, it's super important to separate out what the tenant pays versus affordable housing, because I've seen too many times people get confused on what the tenant owes versus the government. So what you want to do here is, if the rent's going to be $800 and the tenant's paying like $200 of that portion, I like to put $200. Okay, and you could put something like tenant's rent portion, something like that, and then the other charge here would be affordable housing. In this case, I don't think we have a GL account for this actually, so just for this example, I guess we can I'll just put association. We'll just pretend this is affordable housing, but then I can put section 8's rent portion, something like that. And remember, the tenants see this in their portal, so that's what's helpful too, is the tenant can see what section 8's paying versus what they're paying. That's the other part of it I like too, because if you put just the whole thing under rent income, it gets confusing really quick. Okay, highly recommend you do this. All right, so something to point out there that's really helpful with automated rent charges. All right. So that's a little bit about how to set up automated charges in Buildium. The next thing we're going to touch on here is the late fees. Now, for the most part, unless for whatever reason there's a certain tenant that you want a different late fee policy for compared to any other lease, you would do that right here by overriding. But in any case, most of your late fee settings should fall under the global policy, of course. So I'm going to go to settings, application settings, and then go to late fees right here. Okay. And this is where I can set up my late fee policies. Now, I touched on this a little bit in another video, but I'm just coming back here so you know where to go again when it comes to a tenant's ledger and the automated late fees. If for whatever reason you do have overrides, whether it's on the property level or on a lease level, you can always check on those policies by just going to reports. We're going to scroll down here. Maybe we're not scrolling down too much. Here, let's see. Late fee policy. Here it is. It's on the property level section right here. Okay. Late fee policies. And you can run it for specific properties if you want. A lot of times I just run it for all properties, but hey, you can do what you need to do. And what's cool is like it will tell me what the policy scope is. So this one, for instance, is using a late fee policy that's on a specific lease. So the lease has its own unique policy essentially. And global just means it's following that policy that's under settings and application settings section here. And you might once in a while see anything on a property level would be found under rentals, properties. Go here. All right, and then you would go to financials. And then you would go to lease payment settings, override late fee settings. But if it already has an override, it would just have the policy here and you would just be able to edit it or delete it. So, all right. So the late fee policies, keep in mind, those are really important to get right from the beginning because it can get real confusing real quick if you have charges that you're not expecting on tenant ledgers. Probably the biggest problem I see with late fee policies especially is when a tenant's ledger gets messy. What happens is if there's misallocations over here when looking at a ledger by account, so just to give you guys this example really quick, this is the most common late fee policy problem I see, or late fee charge problem I see. Just to give you a quick example here, because sometimes once in a while, a tenant's balance might say 0, but then you see a late fee get charged and you're kind of like, why did a late fee get posted? It's when you have a problem like this. So basically, here, let's just pretend that the charge here is like $200. Something like that. Bear with me here on the example. So it's kind of like this, right? I'll see this problem where someone has a credit balance under here, but then a balance owed here. And I'm going to lower this amount too, because what I want to show you basically is if the balance on the ledger is 0, technically speaking, right? Because basically, if I look at the ledger just from here, well, they don't owe anything, right? And then I see a late fee get posted. I'm like, why did that just happen? If I go to by account, look at the ledger by GL account specifically, I see there's a balance owed here, but a credit balance here. So the system basically thinks they still owe for this, but they have a credit for this. And that's why the late fee gets posted. It's just a super common problem I see. So if you ever do see a late fee get posted, even though the tenant's ledger is $0 owed, always check by account. That's like basically 98% of the time where the problem's coming from. Okay, but that's just a little bit about late fee policies. That's the problems tend to be pretty minimal because it just works super well if you have the policy set up from the get-go, and just make sure your ledgers are clean so the late fees post correctly. All right, but yeah, that's a little bit about receiving rent payments, guys, and looking at automated charges on ledgers. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to APM. Check us out at apmhelp.com. Reach out at info@apmhelp if you want to reach out to us about anything you need. And yeah, guys, stay tuned for more videos. Thank you.